All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something we all kind of think we know inside and out: marriage. In popular culture, of course, marriage is the ultimate romantic ideal, right? The whole happily ever after. But what actually happens if we strip away the romance and just look at the bare mechanics of the law? Well, according to a really fascinating functionalist critique, based on the work of legal theorist Martha Fineman, the law sees marriage quite differently. It doesn't see a fairy tale, it sees an administrative tool, a highly effective mechanism for the state to manage the inevitable dependencies and vulnerabilities of human life. And often, it does this by shifting the burden right off its own shoulders and onto yours.
We've got a lot of ground to cover today, moving through 6 key areas. We'll start with the myth of autonomy, then look at predictability, viability, synergy, the illusion of formal equality, and finally, this really interesting concept called the caregiving dyad. Let's just dive right in.
Starting us off, the myth of autonomy. So historically, Western law has built the institution of marriage around this idea of the autonomous liberal subject. It basically pictures two perfectly rational, completely independent adults signing a business contract. Almost like merging two Fortune 500 companies. But Feynman argues this totally ignores reality. We aren't invincible. We're actually what she calls vulnerable subjects. Think about it. We're born dependent, we get sick, we age, and we rely on others. We're fundamentally interdependent, not completely autonomous.
And this brings us to a really thought-provoking quote. Feynman basically flips our standard definition of vulnerability completely on its head. Usually, we think of vulnerability as this flaw, right? Like a weakness we need to overcome. But the source material highlights that vulnerability is actually universal, inevitable, and continuous. It's just baked into our biology. By pretending we're all perfectly autonomous and invincible, the legal system completely fails to build institutions that provide what we actually need, which is resilience.
Moving right along to our second concept, predictability and blanket consent.
So, you might be wondering, how exactly does the state use marriage to keep its own administrative costs down? Well, it's through this mechanism called blanket consent. See, when the state issues a marriage license, it isn't just throwing a party for your relationship, it's standardizing private life so that the legal fallout of things like death or divorce is completely predictable. But here's the kicker. It takes a massive shortcut to get there. The law just assumes that by saying "I do," a partner instantly signs up for a literal lifetime of future roles. We're talking doing the dishes, managing elder care, maybe even giving up career promotions for unpaid caregiving, all without any ongoing negotiation. Sure, it makes life super easy for the judicial system, but it completely ignores the actual lived reality and true consent of the people involved. All right, that brings us to section 3, viability and hidden dependency. When we talk about viability, basically how we literally sustain human life, Feynman's critique gets really interesting. It argues that modern governments actually use the nice-sounding concept of family privacy as a sort of shield. By declaring the family a private sphere, neoliberal states quietly privatize the massive costs of managing human dependency. I'm talking about raising kids, caring for the sick, looking after our elders. The government basically shifts this gigantic burden of basic human survival off its own plate and directly onto the private family unit. It's a very clever way to excuse itself from providing robust, public care systems. But here is the trap, and it's something Feynman calls derivative dependency. Imagine a parent who leaves the workforce to raise their kids. They are stepping up, right? They're generating resilience for the whole family. But almost instantly, they become financially dependent on their partner's income. Their own personal viability plummets just to support the state's viability. It's a hidden dependency, and caregivers are forced right into it without any real safety nets. Okay, moving on to section 4, synergy and collective debt. This is all about how society actually sustains itself over time. We have to recognize that raising the next generation of citizens or caring for our elders isn't just some private lifestyle choice. It is absolutely a public good. Society literally could not survive without it. Because everyone benefits from this caregiving, Feynman argues it creates a collective debt. Society owes a massive debt to the caregivers doing all this heavy lifting. But under our current legal framework for marriage, that collective debt is totally ignored, and the entire burden gets dumped squarely on the shoulders of individual, unpaid caregivers isolated within their own formal units. Which leads us to part 5, the illusion of formal equality. Now, here is the really dangerous paradox of modern legal equality. Modern family law absolutely loves to use the language of fairness, treating spouses like perfect equals. It enforces what we call formal equality. For example, A judge might mandate a strict 50-50 split of bank accounts and assets during a divorce. And hey, on paper, that sounds incredibly fair, doesn't it? But the problem is, it completely ignores structural inequality. It totally glosses over the reality that one partner might have sacrificed a decade of career advancement and pension contributions to do all that unpaid caregiving we were just talking about. Because, let's be real, imposing formal legal equality on people who are in structurally unequal positions doesn't actually create justice. The source text describes this as a functional gap. It's this massive disconnect between what the law promises and what it actually delivers on the ground. By ignoring the real-world sacrifices and the opportunity costs borne by the caregiver, this illusion of equality actually deepens the exact inequality it claims to fix. It's a system that frequently pushes caregivers and their children straight into poverty post-divorce. And finally, that brings us to Section 6, the transition to the caregiving dyad. So how in the world do we fix a framework that the critique views as being this broken? Well, Fineman proposes a pretty radical conceptual surgery. The idea here is to shift the law's main focus completely away from the sexual family, the romantic couple, and move it over to the caregiving dyad. Now, a caregiving dyad is basically any relationship built on actual dependency and care. Think a parent and a child, or maybe an adult caring for their elderly parent. The argument is that the goal of the law shouldn't be to privilege romantic couples. It should be there to protect and resource the actual bonds of care that keep our society running. To actually make this happen in the real world, the analysis points to 3 pretty radical steps. Number 1, abolish marriage as a privileged legal category. Because seriously, why should a romantic couple get exclusive tax breaks and institutional perks that 2 sisters caring for their aging mom don't get? Number 2, the state needs to step up and recognize caregiving as a collective state debt, meaning things like paid leave, universal social insurance, and care subsidies. And number 3, redefine marriage. Instead of a private contract that just lets the state off the hook, it should be an area where the state is directly accountable for providing the resources we need to manage human vulnerability.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with what might be the ultimate blind spot of our entire legal system. Think about this. If society depends on care for its very survival, why do caregivers bear the cost all alone? It's a wildly provocative question, right? It really challenges everything we assume about family justice in the law. It demands that we finally drop this myth of the completely independent individual and start building a responsive society that actually honors our shared, undeniable human vulnerability. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today, and keep questioning the structures around you.